This is Jessica Ackerman, and I'm here to present Module 1, Critical Review, on Behaviorism and Social Learning Theory. Behaviorism was developed by many different theorists. To name a few, there was Watson, Thorndike, Skinner, Guthrie, Hull, and Tolman. Behaviorism was used to predict or control behavior. So theorists would research by using animals, and even in humans, they would add a stimuli or take a stimuli away, and they could predict or control behavior in those ways. Social learning theory was created by Bandura. Social learning theory is the belief in one's own ability to accomplish a task. People could have a high self-efficacy or a low self-efficacy, and that decided whether or not they believed that they could accomplish something. And we're going to talk about both of these throughout this module, Critical Review. Now, behaviorism and social learning theory were developed a really long time ago. So why should we still study these theories today? These theories are valid theories that have been researched and they've been proven effective. As an assistant principal at an elementary school, I have personally seen these techniques that we've studied in Module 1 be effective for changing behavior in both academics and in disruptive behaviors that we've seen at school. We also need to review these theories because all humans are different. Technology is forever changing as well, and so it would be really interesting to look into the behaviorism and social learning theory in conjunction with all the new technology that we have, like brain scans, and include in the behaviorism how we have emotions behind things. Behaviorism only looks at facts and observations. However, we know that there are reasons why people act the way that they do and what's going on in their head at the time that they act. So it's interesting. It would be interesting to see more studies on behaviorism and social learning theory included with the new technology that we have today. After studying Module 1 on behaviorism and social learning theory, my personal evaluation is that it's effective. And the techniques and things, I work closely as an assistant principal with our licensed school psychologist, and she uses many of these techniques with students. And I've also seen it work with teachers as well, being in the human resource department as well. The way that you manage people and their behaviors, I've been able to make a lot of connections with the things that we've talked about and learned about in Module 1. Social learning theory goes along with the self-efficacy and someone's belief in how they can perform a job. And we use this in our elementary school to help encourage students and to show them that they can be successful. And I've seen that it really does work if you approach it the right way. And I've also seen it work in teachers and even in parents that are defeated sometimes. We've been able to really look at and go baby steps, just like it talks about in our module, how we can show them that if they can be successful in some areas and we praise them along the way, that their self-efficacy can grow and change. So my personal evaluation of behaviorism and social learning theory is that it works, and it was very interesting to be able to make those connections. Now I'm going to give a short summary of behaviorism and social learning theory, and as I go through my summary, I am going to tell the intended purpose of the theorists as they created this theory. And I'm also going to give you some real-world applications that I've seen in my career and in elementary school. And whenever I give those examples, there are many examples where it works for both behavior and academics. So behaviorism, the intended purpose of the theorists was to predict or control behavior. So they were being able to introduce a stimuli or take one away and be able to predict how someone would behave And in that way, if they could predict it, they could control it if they wanted someone to behave a certain way. There are two types of behaviors. There's respondent behavior and there's operant behavior. Now, respondent behaviors are involuntary, like reflexes. Driscoll talks about in her book, she gives two good examples. She says like a baby startling at a loud noise, or the book also talked about Pavlov's dog, how the dog salivated uncontrollably whenever he smelt the food. So those types of behaviors are like reflexes. They just involuntarily happen. Now, operant behaviors are going to be the ones that can be controlled. They are elicited behaviors. One type of operant behavior or way to elicit a behavior is reinforcement. Reinforcements are used to increase a behavior. There's positive reinforcements and negative reinforcements. Positive reinforcements are like if you do this, then you can get this. It's where you're adding a stimuli in order to increase a response. So some things that we do in the elementary school in order to kind of control behavior is, that's an example of a positive reinforcement would be like earning stickers, or we have Eagle Bucks that the kids can earn. Or you may say, if you do this, you can get extra recess, or we've even had some kids earn computer time. We even have one teacher that instead of having homework be a punitive thing, she uses it as a reinforcement. So the kids, if they do a certain number of homework, every time they bring back their homework, they get a ticket. And then they can use those tickets to spin a wheel where they can earn rewards. So this is a positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when someone exhibits a desired behavior, and in response to that behavior, something that's undesirable is taken away. So it reinforces that behavior. One example that Driscoll gives is the beeping of the seatbelt. And that helped me really to understand. So the beep that the car makes when you don't buckle up is undesirable. So you want to do the desirable behavior and buckle so that the undesirable beeping will go away. Some examples of where this is applied in the classroom is, we had one example actually in one of our discussions in this class where one student hated to get up in front of the class and speak in front of the class, but the teacher wanted that kid to participate in class. So they didn't want to get up there, so they didn't want to participate because then they would think that the teacher would want them to come up in front of the class and speak. So one way to use negative reinforcement in this way is to explain to the kiddo that if you participate in class and I see that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and you're showing this desired behavior and I notice that, then I will take away that undesired feeling that you're going to be put up in front of the class. As long as you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, I'm going to take that option off the table and you will not have to come up in front of the class and speak. So that is a way that we have used negative reinforcement. Shaping and chaining are ways to teach a child or any person a new behavior. In shaping and chaining, shaping is more for simpler behaviors and chaining is for more complex. But really it just means that it's baby steps on the way to accomplishing a task. Instead of accomplishing the task all at once, you're reinforcing those baby steps along the way. One of the things that I can apply that to in the classroom is our fact fluency sheets that are timed. Students have so long to complete so many problems for fact fluency. But the kiddos can set their own goal and mark a line on where they want to be, and then each time try to beat their own goal until finally they're completing the entire sheet in a time limit. So you're reinforcing it after every little baby step, and then at the end they're able to complete the whole sheet on their own. So that's an example of shaping. One example of chaining, which would be a more complex behavior, an example that we have for that one is we have a kid this year actually that is a major discipline problem, and right now we have taken him out of every part of school except for the academics. He doesn't eat with his friends, he doesn't go to recess, he doesn't go to his extracurricular classes. He has to earn those things back. So he has a sheet, and whenever he earns so many tokens, he's able to go into one of those non-academic classes as a reward. and he can earn that time back in baby steps until he can earn his whole day back and have a successful day at school. So that's a good example of chaining, where we're doing baby steps to complete the task. And then reinforcement schedules to maintain those behaviors is where eventually you need the kid to grow out of getting a reward every single time that they do something that you want them to do. So in order to do that, you can say, instead of every time, we're going to do it every 2 times. Every 2 times that the desired behavior happens, then you'll get a reinforcement. Or it could be every 15 times there's a desired reinforcement. And so this will maintain the behavior without having to reinforce every single time. Reinforcement removal is whenever we are taking away the reinforcement. And a lot of times I think my real world example is parenting. So when you ground someone, your kiddo may have maybe in timeout, maybe removed from the situation if they have an undesired behavior that happens, or they're not showing the desired behavior that's warranted. Response cost, we have kids at our school that earn tickets for good behavior. They're called Eagle Bucks. Whenever they are caught doing something that's undesirable, they have to pay a ticket back. So they're having to pay for their undesired behaviors. Now, punishment is what I think of as corporal punishment in our school. We actually do corporal punishment. And one of the things that Driscoll explains in Module 1 is that there are some negative side effects to that. That it could cause fear in the kiddos, or it could even make like an I can't do type of attitude. So those we use on last resort. Now to tell a little bit about social learning theory. The theorist for this is Bandura, and his purpose for this theory is to show that self-efficacy can be just as important as intelligence. Someone with high intelligence and low self-efficacy may not be as successful as someone with high self-efficacy and low intelligence. Our principals and assistant principals at our school actually did a book study on growth and fixed mindset from Carol Dweck that also talks about self-efficacy. That growth mindset means that you can learn more and you can always get better and you can always do better. Fixed mindset is the belief that you're only born with a certain intelligence and you cannot be or do any better than what you were born with. So that's that low and high self-efficacy. Bandura also talks about how there's 4 ways that self-efficacy can be developed. Mastery experiences is whenever a person is successful at something and they feel that accomplishment, and so they feel that I can do, they build that in themselves. Vicarious experiences is by seeing role models that are similar to yourself that have been successful, so you think, if they can do it, I can do it. Verbal persuasion is whenever coaches or teachers or role models persuade someone that they can do it. You can do it. You've got this. That sort of persuasion. And then emotional and physiological states, Driscoll talks about how that's your gut feeling, that you feel that you can do something. In Bandura's article that was posted in Module 1, one of the things that I thought was very interesting was the teacher's self-efficacy. It talked about how teachers with high self-efficacy have more time for academics in their classroom. They challenge their kids, they're supportive to their students, and they reward and encourage their students' success. However, on the flip side, teachers with low self-efficacy focus more time on non-academic activities. They're less supportive to their kids. They give up on their kids because they think they can't help them. And instead of praising them, they will reprimand them more for their failures. Now, my critique for behaviorism and social learning is that it should absolutely be studied, especially for those that work with students and for those that work with human behavior, like in human resources. I think that we need to remember that we need to fade out those rewards and reinforcements, and we need to teach students to be more self-regulated so that they can monitor their own behaviors and be more intrinsically motivated, because in the real world, they're not going to have that reward and reinforcement after every desired behavior. In conclusion, both behaviorism and social learning theory are effective, and they're still in use today. I use them every day in my job. We need to remember that there are emotions that are connected to those behaviors, and that the behaviors and techniques do not always work 100%, and that